Tonight, power reveals its true face. A US president orders a raid in Caracas. A foreign leader is seized. More than 100 people are dead. And just days later, that same president extends an invitation to the Colombian president into the White House with a smile and words of great honor. This is not chaos. This is how modern power works. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what you're watching is not simply a clash of personalities or an explosion of rhetoric. It is a system in motion where force, finance, drugs, and oil are woven into a single geopolitical script. One moment, insults. The next, diplomacy. Behind both, leverage. If you want to understand why threats turn into handshakes and why entire nations are caught in between, stay with me. Because this story is not about Venezuela alone or Colombia alone. It's about the rules of the world you are living in. And once you see the pattern, you won't unsee it. Now, let's slow this moment down and define the problem clearly. What exactly is the problem here? At the surface, it looks fragmented. A raid in Venezuela, sanctions on Colombia, an invitation to Washington, harsh words, followed by warm language. But geopolitics is rarely about isolated events. It is about structure. The United States is confronting two realities at once. First, an unstable region where drugs flow north, oil flows outward, and legitimacy is fragile. Second, a global moment in which American power must act decisively but cannot afford to look reckless. Colombia sits at the center of this contradiction. It is a critical partner in the drug war, a major energy producer, a regional hinge between cooperation and defiance. Venezuela, meanwhile, represents the other extreme: isolation, sanctions, and now direct intervention. So the question is not why these events happened. The question is how they fit together, because when power applies pressure in one place, it must rebalance elsewhere. Force creates consequences. Diplomacy manages them. To understand why this sequence feels so jarring, we have to go backward into history, incentives, and cycles. That context changes everything. To understand this moment, we have to step back. For decades, the United States has treated this region through two enduring lenses: drugs and resources. Colombia became central not by accident, but by function. Cocaine routes, extraction industries, strategic alignment. Over time, Colombia evolved into a keystone state too important to abandon, too problematic to ignore. Venezuela followed a different path. Sanctions hardened, dialogue collapsed. Oil, once a bridge, became a weapon. Control over energy markets replaced diplomacy as the primary language of pressure. These are not sudden shifts. They are part of a recurring cycle. When drug production rises, pressure intensifies. When oil access tightens, leverage hardens. When leaders resist, rhetoric escalates, and eventually, action follows. What makes this moment different is speed, the compression of timelines, threats, raids, sanctions, and invitations unfolding within days, not years. That acceleration reflects a system under strain, one that no longer has the luxury of patience. And when systems lose patience, they stop explaining themselves. They act. That brings us to the first rupture, the moment when words turned into force. It began as a warning. Then it became an operation. In the middle of the night, US forces stormed Caracas. A president was seized. And by the time the dust settled, more than 100 people were dead. Numbers first understated, then revised, then quietly absorbed into the background noise of power. This was not just a tactical strike. It was a message. For years, Venezuela had been boxed in by sanctions, isolation, and economic pressure. This raid marked a shift from containment to removal, from leverage to force. And once that line is crossed, there is no ambiguity left. The justification was familiar: stability, security, drugs, order. These words always arrive before action. They make violence legible. They make it sellable. But here's the deeper meaning. Once a system proves it is willing to take a leader by force, every other leader in the region recalculates. If this can happen there, it can happen anywhere. If you're trying to understand the rules being written in real time, this is the moment to pay attention. Because what followed was not restraint, but something far more revealing. What matters most is what we don't immediately see. Behind the raid, behind the insults, behind the sudden diplomacy, there is a mechanism at work, quiet, systematic, and brutally consistent. Power today is no longer exercised through occupation. It is exercised through control points, drugs, oil, financial access, legitimacy. When you dominate those, you don't need to govern a country. You only need to shape its options. Colombia illustrates this perfectly. Accused of allowing cocaine to flourish, pressured through sanctions, publicly humiliated, and yet never fully cast out, because Colombia is not meant to be broken. It is meant to be managed. Venezuela, by contrast, crossed a different threshold. When sanctions failed to produce compliance, escalation followed. Oil markets were frozen, then seized, then militarized. This is not inconsistency. It is hierarchy. Partners are corrected, adversaries are removed. Once you see this, the contradictions dissolve. Threats and invitations are not opposites. They are tools used at different stages of the same process. And when this mechanism is activated, it rarely stops at one country. That's when the system tightens. And the next shock arrives. The second shock didn't come with helicopters. It came with words. Public threats, personal insults, sanctions revived and reinforced. The Colombian president was described not as a partner, but as a problem. A man accused of poisoning another nation. A leader told, bluntly, to watch his back. This matters because language is not decoration in geopolitics. It is preparation. When a leader is publicly delegitimized, the ground shifts beneath him. Allies hesitate, markets react, domestic pressure intensifies. Even without a single soldier moving, power is already being applied. And then almost immediately the tone changes. A phone call, appreciation, an invitation to Washington. The insult gives way to ceremony. This is not reversal, it is calibration. Pressure creates vulnerability. Diplomacy exploits it. By the time the handshake is offered, the balance has already shifted. The choice is no longer between defiance and cooperation. It is between isolation and survival. That is the second crisis. Not explosive, but corrosive, because it teaches leaders that sovereignty is conditional. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay contained. It moves outward to the people. And this is where you enter the story. Because behind presidents and press releases, it is ordinary people who absorb the shock. When sanctions tighten, prices rise. When threats circulate, investment pauses. When legitimacy is questioned, instability follows, and it never asks permission before reaching your life. If you live in Colombia, you feel it in uncertainty, in jobs that hesitate to grow, in a future that feels conditional. If you live in Venezuela, you feel it far more brutally in loss, fear, and the quiet normalization of violence. And if you live far away, watching from a screen, don't mistake distance for immunity. Drug routes, oil markets, migration waves, these systems connect us whether we like it or not. This is how global power actually works. Not as an abstract game between elites, but as pressure applied downward, one decision at a time. So when you hear words like security or stability, ask who pays the price. Ask whose life becomes more fragile so another system can feel more in control. If this analysis helps you see that connection, share it, because awareness is the first form of resistance. And from here, the effects no longer stop at borders. Once these forces are unleashed, they don't stay local. What happens in Caracas ripples through Bogota, Washington, and far beyond. Energy markets respond first. The moment the United States signals long-term control over Venezuelan oil, expectations shift. Prices anticipate scarcity or leverage. Other producers recalibrate. Consumers, thousands of miles away, feel it at the pump. Then comes geopolitics. Allies watch closely, not just in Latin America, but globally. They ask a quiet question. If a president can be removed here under these justifications, what does protection really mean elsewhere? Rivals, too, take notes. They look for openings, for influence, for moments when American power appears decisive but also unilateral. Every action meant to demonstrate strength also creates space for countermoves. And the region itself begins to polarize. Some governments lean closer to Washington, seeking shelter. Others harden their rhetoric, fearing vulnerability. Neutrality becomes harder to sustain. This is how local crises become global signals. Not through speeches, but through precedent. Once a line is crossed, it redraws the map of what is possible. And that brings us to the question that matters most. What comes next? When systems reach this point, the future narrows into paths, not certainties, but scenarios. The first is the optimistic one. Pressure works, diplomacy stabilizes Colombia, drug cooperation deepens, energy markets normalize. The region absorbs the shock, and the message of force deters further escalation. Power, in this version, is seen as decisive but temporary, a reset rather than a rupture. The second scenario is muddier. Cooperation becomes performative. Leaders comply publicly while resisting privately. Sanctions linger. Trust erodes. The region enters a long phase of managed instability. No collapse, but no resolution either. A low hum of tension becomes permanent. And then there is the darkest path. Force begets imitation. Legitimacy collapses faster than stability can be rebuilt. Leaders govern defensively. Citizens lose faith. Violence normalizes. External powers exploit the fractures. What began as control turns into fragmentation. Which path emerges depends less on rhetoric and more on restraint. Systems can project power, but they cannot escape consequence. Every intervention teaches a lesson. The question is, who learns faster? The architects of pressure or those living under it? Because the future is not decided in one raid or one meeting. It is decided by whether power remembers its limits. And that brings us to the final insight. Here is the final truth. What you've witnessed is not randomness, and it is not madness. It is a system revealing itself clearly, almost honestly. A system where power moves faster than legitimacy, where control is prioritized over consent, where the language of morality is used to manage the reality of dominance. This is not about one president, or one country, or one raid. It is about a world where strength is measured by how quickly rules can be bent and how quietly the costs are absorbed by others. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems like this don't collapse from resistance alone. They collapse when they forget why restraint mattered in the first place. The question, then, is not whether power can act. It always can. The question is whether it still understands the difference between order and stability. If this analysis helped you see the pattern beneath the headlines, share it, stay curious, and stay critical. Because the next chapter of this story is already being written somewhere else, by someone else, under a different justification. And when it appears on your screen, you'll know what to look for. I'll see you in the next one.